Presented by RomulusIT.com, offering remote support for common computer problems. Landry.Audio, listen, like, and subscribe. Today I'm speaking with Mark Gell, who you will find is a contributing columnist in our business title, The Australian Business Executive. Mark has worked in and advised CEOs, boards, and heads of state for almost 40 years. He has run strategy, policy, and stakeholder management teams in government in some of Australia's top 50 publicly listed global corporations. Schooled in the application of property rights, Mark is a believer in freedom of speech and expression as the cornerstone of strong democracies. How are things today, mate?
Oh, look, really good. Thanks, Jesse.
Good. Excellent.
Good to be here.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, as I said, we've had the chance to speak on a few occasions now, and you've been good enough to write contributing columns for a couple of our business titles, and that's kind of led to becoming telephone buddies to a bit of a degree, which led to the chat about bringing you on to talk more broadly about the work that you do in different business and political issues that will hopefully be of interest to some of our listeners. Before we kick off into there, Mark, you work as the CEO for Reputation Management, which effectively helps corporates around these issues. There's going to be a lot of people that don't really know kind of what's happening in the boardroom behind closed doors. Do you want to just kind of give us a peek and a bit of a 101 about, what you do and often some of the issues that businesses and corporates are dealing with?
Yeah, look, that's a really big question. I'll have to correct you too. I'm the founder and a director of the business, okay. But I do advise large corporates. Look, it's interesting. Reputation in itself is an interesting field. At the core of reputation is trust, and if you don't have trust, you can't build reputation. So, trust in itself is built around what people say, what corporations say, what governments say, what anyone says. And if people are out there espousing different things and people don't trust what they say, then your reputation is not going to go forward. Why is reputation important? So the layer above reputation is the license to be able to do things. In other words, if people don't trust what you say, you don't have a reputation. If you don't have a reputation, then your license to be able to get on and operate and do the things that you want, your bandwidth is cut back significantly. So from a board and a CEO point of view and a large corporate point of view, when you've got an organization that's got tens of thousands of people spread around the globe, operating in multiple different jurisdictions with multiple cultures, with multiple laws and regulations, you have to have something at the core that is important that holds all that together, which is basically the ethics upon which you do things. People call it corporate culture, but it's more than corporate culture.
That still seems like quite a big minefield for people that might not work within the space, that kind of are trying to understand what you do. Do you have any sort of practical example?
Those closest to me ask me what I do as well.
Yeah.
So it's not unusual. Look, and there's a really good reason for that, because what we do does not actually bubble up to the public. In other words, we don't go around and yell from the rafters what we do. That's not how you manage reputation. A lot about managing reputation is what doesn't get out there as much as what gets out there. A lot of people sit back and say, oh, you're just PR. And it's like, well, no, we're not PR. PR is the positive promotion of goods, services, people, and so on and so forth. Now, we do some of that work. But what it's about is sitting back and saying, okay, look, you have an issue that's confronting you that's on the table right now. How you manage that issue with your key stakeholders and how you engage with those stakeholders is going to have a huge impact on the outcome of whether or not that particular issue is managed successfully or not. Now, what can be an issue? An issue can be everything from a plane crash, with which I've managed, extortions, right through to actually getting a project off the ground and navigating that project successfully through the various approval stages to get it to its final successful outcome. So it actually weaves its way through every aspect of the way that you do business. And at the core of reputation, is as I mentioned, it's trust. And trust is being your word. Now, as individuals, being your word's very important, but as corporations, it's even more important.
I understand, what you're talking about, what you do, and I assume that you must sign NDAs when you work with a lot of clients. Is there typically, when you walk into an office, or is there a case study that you tend to remember? Like when I think about these sorts of issues, I kind of remember, was it 5 or 10 years ago now, about the Volkswagen brake debacle on their cars in the US, or was that with Toyota? So similar sort of examples that you talk about within your own circles of saying like, hey, had this been managed from the start, it wouldn't have led to your share price falling off a cliff.
It's what, what you're alluding to is the fact that it takes a very long time to build up trust, and you can blow it up in a day. There's some classic examples of that. I mean, you mentioned one, which was the Volkswagen debacle over the diesel engine, and how they falsified data on the emissions from those motors. And
that's a separate one. I forgot about that one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was huge. I mean,
yes,
that was for want of a better word, fraud at a very, very large level. Look, one that comes to mind that gives you a really good example on how to manage reputation or how not to manage reputation was the BP oil spill. You had a situation there where the MD made two statements which he shouldn't have made. One was
Gulf of Mexico one we're talking about.
The Gulf of Mexico one. He said that, look, it's a very small drop in a very large ocean.
Yeah.
For the local communities that live around that area, it's not a small drop. They were impacted by it for years. They had to do huge cleanups. The other thing he said is, I'm going on holiday. I mean, I can remember I worked in a steel company, and the 2/3 of our steel production came from one facility. We had a major crisis in that facility. They had a slippage in the blast furnace, and it had to be turned off. Now, when you're a company and you're facing 2/3 of your production suddenly going south, and you have contracts to supply steel, you're in a major crisis. The MD packed his things up and he went down on site. He said, my place is to be down on site at the steelworks to help people, not to get in their way, to help clear the path, to get whatever experts that are necessary to be able to come in and fix this issue. So I was sent out to talk to all the shareholders and engage with all the various parties at the stakeholder engagement level. And I used to get asked the question, why isn't the MD doing this? And I said, well, because the MD's down at the steelworks and he's actually right at the heart of the issue and assisting where he can. And they said, well, how can he assist? And I said, well, he's a PhD in metallurgy, so that might help. But what he can do is get the right sort of experts on site to help the local workforce sort the thing out. And it was sorted out. So how you manage these things is more important than the actual incident itself. I mean, it was interesting in that particular instance, our share price went off 30% as a result of the blast furnace going down. We got it back up again and started running. And then it went down another 3 times in the next 6 months. But the share price didn't move. And the reason the share price didn't move in the subsequent events that we had with the blast furnace was because we managed it so well. In fact, I had one person who ripped me apart in a particular meeting. He spent, this was a large fund manager, he spent 40 odd minutes just ripping into me. Okay. And just going through, this, that, and this and that, and, and Blue Scope tell me this, and this person tells me that, et cetera, et cetera. And I waited till he's finished, and fair enough. I waited till he's finished. I said, well, look, I'll tell you what, you find me a person that's operated a blast furnace for 23 years non-stop, of which there are not many. It's the second longest running blast furnace in the world. And I might sit back and listen to it. And he went, oh, well, fair point, fair point. So I dealt directly with this person. Now I met him 3 months later. And what I didn't realize at the time when I first met him was that he had just purchased a big parcel of shares in the company. I only found that out after the meeting, which explains why he was so angry. But he came up to me 3 months later and he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, oh, I heard the blast furnace went down again, but I know you've got it under control, which was interesting because we kept communicating with people. We went out there in a very proactive manner. I went into all the dealing rooms around Sydney and Melbourne. which are the two financial centres in Australia, and got absolutely smashed by all the dealers. But we just approached it in a very, very honest sort of manner, and they appreciated that. And as a result, the share price, which is probably your daily indicator of trust in a company, went back to where it was pretty quickly and stayed there.
It's also interesting that you mentioned the MD went down on the floor, because it's not too often these days about, as you said, the leader in the business kind of hitting the coalface and running things from the ground, which I suppose is maybe not something that you deal with as much anymore.
Yeah, look, it is an interesting observation, but I'm a great believer in the safety school and the DuPont safety approach to management, which is what they call felt management or felt leadership. So if you walk through a manufacturing plant or something like that and you see a piece of paper on the floor, you don't tell one of the workers to pick it up, or you don't tell the manager, make sure that that's cleaned up or whatever. You go over and you do it yourself. You go over, you pick up the piece of paper and you put it in the bin. Why? People see you doing that. You're a leader. They notice leader behaviors and they will emulate those sort of behaviors. So if you're a leader, you can't go out there and tell people to do one thing and then do something completely different. You have to actually exhibit the behaviors that you want others to demonstrate. And felt leadership is a really good way of doing that. And this particular CEO, who was a guy called Dr. Bob Every, who went on to chair some of Australia's largest companies like Wesfarmers, was one of those leaders. He led by example, and he was a very, very good leader as a result.
Just because you mentioned the steel example, I'd be interested to get your views at the moment, because as I mentioned, we do business titles in Australia, Canada, the US, and have a global investor title. I've been hearing a lot about the issues surrounding COVID and supply and demand. And you had mentioned steel. Timber seems to be another one when we talk about areas or industries, including residential construction, where the cost of doing a custom build on a home has jumped by 50 to 60% in some cases on materials. What are you hearing in that space? And I assume that you're talking to people. Do you have any idea if things will begin to kind of come back down to normal? What are you hearing in that space?
Oh, look, it's a great question. And I don't know whether there's a straight answer, to be honest. Yeah, we're going through a process of disruption, that we haven't seen, well, not in my lifetime anyway. And it will take a lot for things to get back to normality. I mean, all we can do is really point to how things were done in the past. When you look at, take Australia as an example, coming out of World War II, I mean, what a lot of people don't realise about Australia was we were in a depression right up until World War II. And we came out of World War II and manufacturing and everything, they called it the milk bar economy, went forward with a vengeance. There's that hypothesis that we're going to come out of this and things are going to open up with a vengeance and things are going to get going again. The other thing that we've never experienced before is the digital disruption that we're going through at the moment at all levels of everything we do. I mean, if you look at the concept of 3D and 4D printing and how that's going to be applied in the next 10, 15 years, you've got to start shaking your head and saying, well, the whole balance is going to change. I mean, in the last 150, 200 years, we've lived in a supply chain world where you dug stuff up out of the ground, you added value to it, you put it on a truck or a train, you take it to a distribution center, the distribution center then sends it out. We're now looking at the complete reverse. What we're looking at is the ability to take a 3D, 4D printer to a site and build whatever you need to build at site. They've already started building a few homes in the US using that sort of technology. And as that technology proliferates, it's going to change the whole logistics landscape significantly. So there are so many different mega trends that are happening at the moment anyway. What the new normal looks like is going to be extremely difficult to predict.
You're choosing probably a different example than I would, but I remember seeing this a couple of years ago of when 3D printers became readily available for the consumer. And there was a guy online that somebody had shown pictures, and he was able to build his own Glock 9mm handgun because they're already plastic. Printed one off, was able to create a gun within an hour for, I assume, a couple $100.
Yeah, look, it's pretty scary. I mean, what it'll do the whole digitization process and virtual reality and augmented reality and so on and so forth, it's going to change things significantly. What the leaders are going to be the people who have the brains, basically, the people who are good designers, the people who are good engineers, the people who are good at maths. They're going to become prominent. You'll be able to download a set of plans off the web from somewhere that you've purchased from a particular company. You'll be able to upload those plans into a 4D printer. They'll be able to go on site and they'll be able to do what they need to do. It completely changes the game. Even my wife and I were reading about augmented humans the other night.
I don't even know what that is.
Well, an augmented human is where they use
Is this the Second Life stuff?
Digital technologies to augment their abilities. They've already developed threads that they can put into people's brains that will actually transmit data from your brain directly to a computer. Now, this is pretty scary stuff.
It is.
And augmented limbs. I mean, to a certain extent, it's like taking a semi-robotic limb that they can now develop for people who have lost limbs and things like that. But taking it to a level that 10 or 15 years time will be quite scary. I mean, you may have seen in Sweden, for example, there are 6,000 people in Sweden wandering around with chips in them. Once you start connecting the ability to harness the energy of the brain and take that energy and apply it to things that are outside, like your computer and things like that, you're in a totally and utterly different realm. So, these things may be 5, 10, 15 years off, but still, that's not that long when I've been in the workforce for 40 years.
There's someone I know posted a news article, and I think it was published by Wired.com. Now, again, you're talking about how scary this stuff gets, because I don't even understand how. I really don't. I don't even understand conceptually how this would work. But they were saying somehow a strand of malware was able to attach itself to a form of DNA to replicate and move on. And again, I don't know anything about that stuff, but that sounds like well beyond sort of traditional sci-fi stuff. And I think we're kind of moving into this area that's I've spoken about previously.
That's one of the things that in one of the articles that we were reading the other night, and that's the ability to transfer viruses in the computer sense into people's brains.
Right.
It's one of the downside risks.
Even when you talk about, but I don't get it. Like it's so above my pay grade that trying to wrap my head around this is
Well, they started developing organic computers about 10 years ago. They're not at a price where consumers can access them yet, but they will. All of these things are, if it's interesting. It's almost like Hollywood, which produced movies about this stuff 20 years ago. It's becoming a reality.
Soylent Green is people. That's all I can say.
Yeah. I rewatched that not long ago, and I just thought it shook my head.
So we're kind of moving off topic, but it was interesting what you had talked about these issues. When we talk about how far 3D printing is going, I think we're going to get into these areas now of freedom of speech and digital technology that we're talking about. But bringing up the onset of technology, I've heard for a few years now how this is going to continue to significantly displace employees, the level of automation. We see it even in our grocery stores at the moment now with automated checkouts. Do you, and this is rather the segue that I'm leading into, this is creating a very large movement for the idea of what do they call it? A guaranteed living wage, of paying people for doing nothing, or alternately the fact that more low-skilled work is going to be completely abolished over the next 10 to 20 years. What do you think about that?
Depends how you define. I don't like using the expression low-skilled workers. I don't know about that, to be honest. We've been talking about technology replacing jobs for decades and decades and decades, and they haven't. I mean, I remember when unemployment was over 10%. And our unemployment levels are anywhere between 3 and 5% across a lot of countries in more recent times. So technology hasn't driven the replacement of jobs. What it has done is it's changed the type of jobs that people do. Rather than going home for every meal like we used to when I was a child, or taking a packed lunch to school, everyone eats out. The service industry growth has been quite marked because people lifestyles have changed, and you just have to have a look at the growth of all the well-being industries and all the fitness industries and all the service industries that have grown up to service people's demands. So I think it will continue to morph moving forward. I don't think there will be massive unemployment as people have been suggesting for the last 7-8 decades. But things will change. The only constant in the world is change. So we should just embrace it, accept it, and understand it, which I think is probably more important. We've entered a very, I wouldn't say scary, but a period where we have to actually sit back and have a look at how technology is determining people's views, how technology is censoring, how technology is cancelling, and driving people's conversations. I won't say thoughts because no one can control a thought, but people's conversations down a certain path. That to me is more dangerous. It's straight out of 1984. And if people don't think it's happening, it's happening. I often put up posts on the LinkedIn platform and about the whole cancel culture and so on and so forth. And I have a lot of people come out and attack me and say, it doesn't exist. I've been cancelled. I've been censored. And I'm not some international star or anything, or huge influencer, but for a technology platform I got cancelled on Twitter, censored on Twitter. I only use Twitter to read what's going on and to listen to all the silly conversations, or read all the silly conversations that take place. I only have something like 120 followers. Why would you censor me? So that to me is more of a dark side of what's going on out there at the moment.
You're not wrong about that, and I think this was originally where we wanted to take this when we said let's chat about this a little bit more publicly. We are experiencing this new form of censorship, and as you said, a lot of people are in complete denial about it now. Where I don't even know when it happened. Was it maybe up until about 10 years ago? The idea of having conversations like this and opening up these topics for conversation was supposed to be perceived as the way that we come to some form of mutual understanding or understand where our differences in opinions lie so that we can find common ground. We don't have that anymore. Anything just gets, I don't even know how to term it. It's just hate speech is one term for it. There seems to be racial undertones with it now, with white supremacy. There's a lot of, it's really gone off the ranks where there will be people even listening to this conversation now as we talk about this, talking about how we're dipping our feet into right-wing conspiracies or things along those lines.
Look, it's let's delayer this. Let's peel back the onion on this. I started writing a book a couple of years ago around leadership and around the ontology of leadership, not around the 7 great skills that it takes to be a leader. In my research, I came across a professor who was president of Armenia, Suskisson, and he said that the world's social media has taken us from a linear world to a quantum physics world. And he's a quantum physicist himself, which was it opened a lot of doors for me in terms of looking at this whole social media thing. Now, I mean, if you go back 20, 30 years ago, people used to go underground, right? So you had your extreme right, extreme left, and they would have their underground meetings, and everything was hush hush, and the FBI and the CIA used to chase them around, and so on and so forth in America. What you're finding now is through platforms like Twitter, all those underground conversations are suddenly above the surface. So what we're seeing is what people really think that used to do it behind closed doors, and they think it's safe doing it on a Twitter platform, which I actually find quite amusing. It's like people who think an email, it's okay to send an abusive email because it's not verbal. We communicate in so many different ways these days that any communication, anything you say, anything you write down, anything you do, your observed behavior is how the world actually views you as a person. A lot of people think that, I think I'm this, therefore I am. It's the other way around. You don't exist in the world except by other people's conversations. So who you really are is not who you think you are, it's what other people think you are. So when you see platforms and huge debates on Twitter, what you're seeing is what was normally the underground conversations above the surface. Now, that has consequences. And there's a really good stat. 80% of I call them twits, not tweets. 80% of tweets are done by 10% of people. That tells you something in itself. It's just I call it the latte drinking cafe set, just debating with each other in a really derogatory sense. I mean, you'll see journalists write articles that go into major publications, and then you'll see them say the exact opposite on Twitter, thinking that, people don't read Twitter. I mean, the ridiculousness of it, the naivety of it is ridiculous. And it comes, when you take it in the context of my original conversation around what reputation is, it's around trust. So when someone sees something written in the media and then sees something that is on Twitter that's the opposite, written by the same person, they start to sit there and say, hey, what's going on here? And then people start to realize that the major forms of traditional information that we used to rely on, you can no longer rely on those. Hence, people's trust in media as an institution is just dwindling rapidly, which in itself, in a cybernetic sense, just raises the conversations that take place on Twitter to a higher level of prominence. Where it ends up, who knows? But we're in this ridiculous period where the people who have control, i.e. the technology platforms, over those conversations are now setting themselves up as adjudicators of those conversations.
That's what I find really problematic in all of this. They're the judge and jury on conversations now.
Well, you can't have defamation protections on the one hand and then censor on the other, which is the big debate that's taking place in the US. If you're going to have protections, then you should respect people's right to say what they damn well think. Back in Sydney's history, we had the Domain in Sydney where people used to go on a Sunday with their wooden carton and stand on their wooden carton.
Soapboxes,
Yeah, the soapboxes, and you had, and the crowds used to go to the Domain and they used to debate things. What we're finding is that, who has a right to tell me how to think? No one. Who has the right to tell me what I can and can't say? No one. I'm not harming anyone. I'm not out there to start a movement to stop people from doing things or start other people from doing things. I'm just expressing views, debating and asking questions. And if we don't ask questions, we don't get to the best solutions. So this era that we're entering of censorship and the worst form of it, cancellation, is very, very 1984.
You had a different perspective on it. I think that this is one of the areas, I guess, where as a traditional liberal, my values are beginning to evolve or adapt on this, because, if you went back 10 years, I would have said in a business, baking the gay wedding cake, it is up to the business owner to decide which customers they want. I think that's more than fine. This now is taking on the complexities of digital platforms with things like Facebook and Twitter, where they control all of the conversation and shut you out from the ways that you're able to communicate. I think, you know, at one point in time, we were talking about a small business owner who operated one business where you still had a choice of multiple operators to go to, where you could say, hey, you know, I find their judgment bigoted. Surely you will bake me a cake. And they would go, of course you would. And you had multiple options for that. But these days, between the platforms of Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, which is owned by Facebook, you know, Microsoft, which is taking over, you've got what, no more than 5 options, where generally one post on any one of those will get you kicked off all 5. Do you not think that this is creating a different conversation of the fact that they are entirely omitting you from the conversation entirely based on, you know, your viewpoints?
Yeah, look, I come from the school, they just don't have the right, in my view. You know, who says that their view's truth and mine's not? What is truth? I mean, if you want to get into the philosophy of this, truth is what someone thinks truth is. So truth in itself doesn't exist. So, you know, truth is not like a chair. It's not like a table. It's not something that you know, truth is something that you give meaning to. Who's to say that the meaning that they put on something is you know, right or wrong, and my meaning is not? And yeah, we need to debate at that level to get to the right sort of answers. What worries me is that when you slice out, you know, if you look at the world in an ontological sense, right? We know what we know. We know what we don't know. We know what others know, and we're actually cutting out a huge part of that conversation through censorship and cancellation. Now, in chopping out that part of the conversation, the overall bounds of knowledge doesn't get bigger, it actually gets smaller. So it could have a deliberate negative impact on the growth of society over the medium term. It's pretty serious stuff as far as I'm concerned, but it's interesting, whenever I raise these sort of things on LinkedIn and stuff like that, I have a whole pile of people pile on and say, oh, you know, don't you think that, you know, right-wing conspiracy theorists, you know, do you agree with them, and so on and so forth? Well, yeah, I don't have to agree with them, but I can listen to what they say, just as much as I listen to what the left-wing conspiracy theorists say. And who says that they're conspiracy theorists? They're just people with views. When people start expressing views that actually potentially harm the well-being of another human being, that's a different matter. And we have laws and we have regulations to deal with those sort of things.
I think, you know, where I wanted to take this, I don't know how much you know about that. And again, I don't know about the app, but there was another social media platform that came out called Parler, which said it based itself around free speech. And immediately, once it came out, again, if I'm on Reddit or any of the other social media, the attack was clearly they're a white supremacist Nazi platform because they will allow people to have these conversations. But it seemed that the platform seemed to have a certain amount of uptake at the moment. And it seemed that there was, again, I'm not agreeing or quantifying their point of view, but I'm just saying at least there was a platform, I guess, where people could have open dialogue. But then effectively to exacerbate that idea of censorship and cutting down, it turns out not too much longer after the fact, any platform that was part of, you know, Apple or the Google, what is it, Play Store, effectively dropped it. So again, another level of censorship of not even allowing you access to that platform. And I think that's kind of what I'm getting at by this. It's like there seems to be alternatives popping up, and big tech is still trying to do its damnedest to find a way to make sure that no conversations that don't coincide with the approved narrative are allowed to happen.
I think the Parler example is a good one. You've struck on a good one there. I mean, yeah, you can't have this conversation around Parler without having the conversation around 2020 election in the US and Trump and so on and so forth. I mean, there is no doubt that, you know, Trump put Twitter on the map. Trump put CNN ratings up, put MSNBC's ratings up, CBS's ratings up.
Well, can and I just, sorry, Mark, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but
No, that's all right.
what we talk about Trump on Twitter, I find it just absolutely outstanding that they've decided that, they're going to censor his tweets, and the day after he is no longer formally the president, they shut down his account. But I remember going back 10 years ago, the only way that you could effectively get hold of ISIS information was via Twitter. Like, I'm just astounded at the judgment calls between, allowing the Chinese Communist Party to Photoshop images about Australian soldiers in battle, which gets away on Twitter, ISIS out there being able to promote and put videos on their message, and then
Yeah.
someone like Trump being censored, who is the leader of the free world or was, for better or for worse.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, the whole Trump thing was and still is quite fascinating. And I think people will look back on history and look at it through many, many different lenses. Yeah, there was no doubt that Trump was divisive, but he wasn't necessarily divisive because he was a divisive individual.
Mm.
He was divisive because he called things out. Yeah, he was his own worst enemy. Attacking people. I don't like attacking individuals. I think attacking individuals is quite disrespectful. And I say that to people who start attacking me personally on my various social media platforms. I said, look, attacking people at a personal level is very small-minded. I don't do it. Sometimes I'm tempted to do it, but I don't, because I think it's so
I feel that too.
And yeah, so Trump, by doing that, detracted from some of the things that he did that were actually quite good.
It overshadowed a lot of his policy.
It overshadowed because it's and there are two different standards. There are a standard for people on the left side of politics is different to the standard for the people on the right side of politics. But I mean,
let's just talk about that. That's a really interesting point that you brought up. I don't want to get away with it. That's a very interesting statement. Can I ask you to elaborate on that?
Well, I mean, Obama could do no wrong, which is fine. But since he's left politics, all of a sudden there's systematic racism in the US. If there was systematic racism in the US, you wouldn't have had a black president. You wouldn't have black members sitting on the Supreme Court. You wouldn't have black members of Congress.
Well, they certainly didn't talk about the crossover of voters from Obama to Trump as well.
Yeah, so it's yet if someone of the right talks of those sort of things, they get slammed. I mean, the right slams the left too. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's not one-way traffic. All you have to do is, I love doing this, is you line up CNN on one side and you line up Fox News on the other and just watch them go at each other.
Yes.
I mean, get over yourselves. Seriously. I mean, who cares what the other network says? I mean, the other network says what it says, but I think the thing I find interesting, though, since Trump's left, CNN's demise and the ratings has been meteoric.
Mm-hmm.
The opposite way, media coming to Earth rather than going through space. Whereas, so the other major networks, they've all come down as well, but the left seems to be getting more damaged than the right. I'll give you the classic example. What's his name? Abarachi? The lawyer who represented Stormy Daniels, who is now gone to jail.
Oh, little
Abarachi
guy.
I forget the correct pronunciation of his name, but I mean, on the left-wing networks, he was a folk hero. He was a potential presidential candidate. He was the one who had Trump on the run. I mean, it was just, you just sat there and listened and just went, oh. Now you won't hear a peep out of them about him since he's been jailed. Jesse Smollett is another example. So the way that things get treated, and probably the classic example is the way that Trump's children got treated versus the way Hunter Biden's been treated. I had someone have a real go at me because I asked questions over the Hunter Biden laptop. And I said, well, let's put the laptop aside for a moment. You got a head of state, being the vice president, who was responsible for a country, whose son gets appointed to an energy company, gets paid whatever it was, $60,000, $80,000 a month to be on the board of that energy company, can't speak the local language, has no experience in energy. He himself goes on the media and says, well, I guess I was appointed because my name's Biden. An investigation opens up into the company, Burisma, that he was a director of. Biden is at a foreign affairs luncheon and brags about the fact that he rang the president of the Ukraine and said, sack the special prosecutor, otherwise you won't get your $1 billion guarantees. If that was in Australia, I tell you what, if that was in New South Wales, there would be massive investigations by the Independent Commission Against Corruption, and there would be charges. Yet nothing happened. Trump has a conversation with the president of the Ukraine, which they released the transcript, yes, which started out as quid pro quo, but they couldn't have that hold. Then it was an inappropriate conversation. And he pays the price. To go to your point, if you're going to, we have to rely as citizens, as members of the public, on our trust, to come back to the reputation thing, on our trust in our institutions. That means our government as one arm. It means our courts as another arm. It means our media as another arm, and so on and so forth. When they don't play fair, in inverted commas, in other words, balanced, and it's out of balance, you've got an issue.
So do you think then, just based on that, do you believe that there is a media bias, left or right?
Oh, look, there's I forget who put it together, but someone put a media map together. I think it was the John Solomon from Just the News that categorized different media outlets. I forget who did it, but look, there's media on both sides. So, is there an overall media bias? I can only go off my own experience back in the 80s when I worked for a head of state here in Australia. I went to a pub, hotel for people in the international audience, but we went to a pub. And that pub was the pub where the drinkers from a Murdoch publication went. And at the time I was working for a person called Nick Greiner, who ended up becoming Premier of a state, New South Wales, here in Australia.
I want to say you're down at the Star or something along those lines, down in Surrey Hills.
Oh, I'm not saying which one it was. Not far from there. But when they found, I was introduced by a particular journalist. This was in 1986, 85. And when they figured out who I was, the journalists formed a circle around me and started spitting on me and calling me names that are related to the female anatomy. Now, I was all of 23, 24. I was scared shitless. Plus, I was just dumbfounded. I was in such a state of shock of being spat on by journalists. So is there bias? Well, clearly at that stage there was. Is there bias today? There's bias in everything today. Is it more left-leaning than right-leaning? It's hard to say. And this is my belief why it's hard to say, my reasoning for that. Yeah, I can watch Sky News here in Australia, and it's very right of centre. I can watch Fairfax Press, it's very left of centre. So who I choose to watch is really up to me. So I can get my feed either from the right or left, and I get my feed from both sides because I have to, because that's the realm that I work in.
What do you think? I want to open up a few things here as we get a little bit deeper into this conversation. So before we talk about that, in your consulting work, then I assume conversations must come up with corporates about potentially where they do their PR and media spend based on left or right news and how that might impact their business. Do conversations like that ever come up of saying if they're going to run a TVC or television commercial at your sort of level before they hit an ad agency of saying, you know, we really shouldn't have it on this channel or there because of blowback to these sorts of things?
No.
Okay.
No. Look, what I find, unless you're going to run a social agenda, look, what I find is that organizations, you know, they're capitalist. And, you know, I'm a great believer in capitalism. So what they'll do is they'll work out which are the best distribution channels, because that's essentially all they are, to get to their particular audiences, to get a particular message across, or to sell a particular item. If it's left-leaning, it's left-leaning. If it's right-leaning, it's right-leaning. Now, if I was selling guns, would I go to a left magazine to sell guns? Probably not. Would I go to underground magazines to sell guns? You know, it depends whether or not you're prepared to. Yeah, well, it depends whether you're prepared to do it legally.
Yes.
But you know, I'm going to, you know, in America, for example, if I was going to sell guns, I'd be looking for Patriot outlets, wouldn't I, to do the distribution?
Yeah,
so yeah, there's purely a capitalist motive in that regard in terms of an organization's product. Now, having said that, yeah, you look at the product itself and say to yourself, you know, an electric car, you're not going to sell an electric car in a RevHead mag initially.
Sure.
You will over time, because electric cars actually go faster than V8s from 0 to 100. I just don't think the RevHead market's got its head around that yet in this country anyway. So we're going to move down that path. But if you have an organization, I'll give you a classic example. An organization, North Face,
the brand,
was
yeah, okay.
advertising. Yeah, they were advertising about how they were going to take on the oil companies. You know, because we can no longer have oil and so on, which is their right to do. The oil industry is the industry that feeds their raw materials. Now, if I was sitting there advising that organization, I'd be sitting there going, wait a minute, take a couple of steps back. You're going to have to go and find natural-based products. And
yeah, what replaces petroleum effectively?
What's going to replace petroleum to make your products, you know, Gore-Tex and stuff like that, and proof and so on and so forth, waterproof, windproof, you know, rated 25,000 by 25,000 and so on and so forth. So, yeah, there is a level of hypocrisy, yeah, that's starting to develop while organizations try and push themselves towards a particular agenda. Now, I'm not dishonoring what they want to do, North Face, in terms of their view towards the oil industry. That's fine. But wow, if I was an oil executive, in fact, I think an oil executive, yeah, there was a CEO of an oil company that put an ad together saying, I find this fascinating because, and then just went through every one of their products and just said, you know, source oil company, and just blew the whole argument apart.
You're going to be a good one to ask about this, because this is a question that I have a lot of the time, that, again, depending upon who I ask, it's like from the moment they open their mouth, there's bias in the viewpoint that they have. When I watch the news frequently, apparently we're already there. If we just switch to renewables tomorrow, we could live on a renewables economy. I think you and I both agree that that's not plausible at this point in time, and it requires a lot of subsidy in underwriting to even get us to that point. But similar to the issues of climate change or greenhouse gases or whatever you want to term it, from the age of about 10, I've been exposed to this at school. along with the concept of peak oil, which again is supposed to have happened 3 or 4 times. You know, I'll be 40 at the end of this year,
Peak
so
oil,
like
yep,
every
yep,
decade it's supposed to happen.
yep, yep.
How again, I don't want to turn this into a left versus right thing, but how much longer do you believe that we are renewable on oil? You've already touched that we can't replace it. Can we, do we have an exit strategy for getting it out of airplanes, tanker vehicles, and other automobiles, which from my understanding is really the issue of.
Look, it's a really, really good question, and it shouldn't be left or right, to be honest. Yeah, we need to look at technologies that are actually going to be kind to the planet. I'm not saying kinder, I'm saying kind to the planet. For the human race to survive in the longer term, we have to maintain the biodiversity, bioflora and biofauna and all that sort of stuff on the planet. There's no doubt about that. I find that when you start reading articles about plastics getting into the food chain through salmon in the Arctic, you start to sit back and go, "Whoa, that's concerning." Nanoplastics. We are going to transition energy whether we like it or not. What that looks like by 2050, who knows? Does it need to happen? Yeah, even the oil companies recognise that it needs to happen. Peak oil is an interesting concept because what peak oil doesn't take into consideration is technology. We can drill deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper these days.
Refine better and better.
And all of that sort of stuff. Is there going to be a transition? Can you switch off the old and switch on the new? No, you can't. I mean, it would be devastating for that to happen. There are some elements of this debate that are hypocritical. I was listening to the deputy leader, Chris Bowen from the Labor Party here in Australia, and he was talking about that we have to shut down the coal industry because the world's moving away from coal. What he failed to mention, and these are just facts.
Power plants, emerging economies.
China's opening up a major coal power station once a week. It's like all of these debates. Is it a good thing to have a healthier environment? I think it's an obvious answer. Yes. Is there climate change? It's an obvious answer. Yes. Is there greenhouse? Yes. I mean, when I studied, I've got a geography major, which these days would be an environmental science major and an economics major. Back then, when we were looking at the whole climate side of things, it was that we needed to have a greenhouse effect because we were sliding into a mini ice age. So, it's a very, very complex debate. I've got a client that has done a major pivot into the area of sustainability, and I think it's a fantastic strategy for this organisation. Why? Because I think it'll actually grow the organisation. 70% of their business was oil and gas just 2.5 years ago. It's now under 50%. The growth opportunity out of sustainability is far greater than the growth opportunity out of oil and gas. But have they jettisoned oil and gas? No, because the way that we're going to get to a better environment is to also do better at the way that we do our traditional industries as well. So it's in industrial processes, it's in input management, industrial process management, as well as looking at renewable technologies. We have to look at the full spectrum to be able to get to the sort of targets that they're talking about. I mean, to get to zero net carbon by 2050 requires $2 trillion a year US spend in renewable technologies. $2 trillion a year from now to 2050.
Oh, look, I've always had the opinion I don't really know what Australia has to do with this until we deal with China, India, and the US. I mean, we're just, as far as I'm concerned, it's all for show until we kind of figure out what those guys are doing. And we know what they're doing. They're building coal power plants, and even in areas like China, India, they're being smarter about it, at least building nuclear, which is really, I'm blown away that this option hasn't been moved to 10 for uptake.
Well, it's interesting because I've been involved in the energy sector for 30 years now. Yeah, we had a technology out of Japan called fluidized bed technology back in the early 90s. Fluidized bed technology is where they heat up sand and you put your municipal waste in that sand and mix it about, steam comes off and you create energy. If you drive into Tokyo, you'll see all these little buildings that look like commercial offices. They're in fact incinerators. They meet they did at the time, it's probably changed now, it's even a tougher standard, I would assume, but the 17th BIMP standard, which is 1 nanogram per cubic meter of dioxides. Mind you, when you look at pouring petrol at a petrol station, that's around 10,000 particles per cubic meter. So, yeah, very, very high standard in terms of pollution control. We tried to get that into there was an incinerator in Sydney that took the rubbish from 5 different municipalities. We were going to convert it for free. You know what they do with all that rubbish now? They shut down the incinerator. They said no, they shut down the incinerator. They now truck it down to the southern side of Sydney. I mean, the extra carbon dioxide it produces, you just sit there and scratch your head because it's just so counterintuitive in terms of what they've done.
Well, my understanding is that recycling isn't even happening now. There was it the Landline or 730 report last year where they effectively found that they are just taking all the recycled goods and shipping them off to landfill anyway? Yep. It's not, there's no recycling taking place apparently.
No. Well, there is some. To say there's none, I don't think is correct. There is some. But, you know, we all feel good because we split our rubbish at home. Yes. We put our plastics in one area, we put our paper in another. You know, we go to the extent at home of putting soft plastic in another and taking that back to the supermarket. We're now going to get another set of bins. So you have your standard rubbish bin. This is in where I live. Standard rubbish bin, your glass and cans and your paper. Now they're going to have a food bin. So we've now got 4 different types of bins. And it all ends up, not all of it, but a great percentage of it ends up in
back together, yes, and then into landfill.
Yeah, you just, and then you have different trucks come up and pick up the different lots of rubbish. I mean, I was saying to someone the other day, I can remember as a kid, one of my jobs was taking out the garbage, right? Twice a week, Monday and Thursday. I still remember it well. But it was a family of 5, and it was a standard garbage bin. A standard garbage bin twice a week. Now you have these huge bins,
yes, which
you fill up. Yeah, you fill up the cardboard one, you fill up the plastic one, you fill up the food waste and general waste one. And you sort of sit there and say, where is all this rubbish coming from? So there are things that we need to do. There's absolutely no doubt about that.
You know, you and I are talking, we're both in Australia. I'm sure we're going to have overseas listeners. You know, this kind of ties in with Trump again. It's very, very particular to Australia. It relates to the US and the fact that China is at some point going to become the global superpower. Before I move into that, I'm sure you would have had these conversations. There's a lot of debate around this. It's going to happen in 10 to 15 to 20 years. It's not going to happen in our lifetime because of the defense systems of the US. What are you hearing in terms of the superpower war between these two nations?
6 of one and a half dozen of the other. I think you've outlined it quite well. I mean, I was just listening to a China expert the other day saying, you know, things aren't as good as it seems within China in terms of its economy. I've been hearing that I can remember 20 years ago when people said that China was going to get to steel producing capacity of 500 million tons in the space of a few years. And at that stage, they were at 100 million tons. And I sort of shook my head and said, no, that's like building 20 of our largest steel works a year. Well, they did it.
Well, didn't they build the Wuhan hospital in a period of like 6 days or something along those lines?
Yeah, and you know what cost is what I say, but look, I was in China, not last was in China, no, last year before 2019. I went to Shanghai and Beijing. Yeah, it's quite incredible what they're doing up there. There's no doubt about it. You know, I went and visited one of their largest hydro energy plants, and the scale was just amazing. But what was even more amazing to me is they built it in 1970. So this wasn't new. So when you see things like that and the scale upon which they do things, it is breathtaking. And you've got to take your hat off to them in terms of how far they've progressed and how many people they've brought out of poverty. So tick, 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 tick. The issue you've got is you've had a regime change in the last 5 years. And what we're seeing now is a different strategy, and it's quite a hostile one when it comes to the West.
Can you just give us a 101 on that? You said so.
Well, yeah,
most
they're
people know the
basically
Communist Party, but you're saying
the CCP. I mean, they've basically come out and said they want to dominate the world.
But you've
Now,
said
what
that
does
there's
that
been a
mean?
strategy change. You said there was something's changed in the
Yeah,
last
well,
5 years.
the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, which at face value looked really good, when you start delving behind the scenes and looking at how they were doing it, and they were building ports in Pacific nations that can take warships.
Yes, and I'm
Not
also
small,
told that
not small freighter ships. And
my understanding
and,
of it is emerging economies where they can build it at high rates of interest and effectively land grab after that too.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing. It's and we don't know what the commercial terms are, but what I've heard and read is it's around 10% interest. Japan did the same sort of thing, but they used to do it at somewhere between 1% and 3% interest. Pacific Island nations don't have that sort of money. They don't have the money to pay the interest. I think it's really interesting that there was one of the ministers from the Solomons required brain surgery, and China offered to take him into China and pay for it, and he said no. He ended up going to Taiwan. I mean, that's an indication to me that not everything is absolutely as it should be. So, look, it's anyone's guess. I mean, I deal with people, having worked with a company that was 60% owned by a company called State Grid, which is the 5th largest corporation in the world, and only recently coming off that company just over a year ago. The Chinese executives and the Chinese people that were involved in that company were great people. They were really, really nice people. But it's a political regime that has become more, you've got to think it's become more authoritarian in the last 5 years. And that is an issue. We know that, the big difference between America and the big difference between authoritarian regimes is authoritarian regimes are prepared to sacrifice citizens to get to an end goal, whereas countries like America take a different view towards that because they have a different view towards the relationship that they have with their citizens. So when they talk about world dominance, what does that mean? What does it mean? Okay, from an economic point of view, you could argue that they are pretty close to world dominance anyway. But what does it mean from a political point of view? Because in China, what they say economically and politically are intertwined.
Yeah. I don't know. Well, that's my question to you.
I've sat and I've listened to a lot of people,
I guess so. Ethically, do we have problems with the fact, because I think when Trump was president, a lot of us said, hey, he's talking with North Korea. Maybe this is a good thing if they can establish some trade, which again, we've talked about the benefits of capitalism, of taking people out of poverty. But with China and its relationship with Australia, we desperately need them for trade. And at the same time, they're going the opposite way. Instead of getting more freedom, we're getting less with, Hong Kong and these Uyghur Muslims. How are there any ethical implications that we should be thinking of when we're bolstering their strength by our necessity for trade with them?
Capitalism doesn't have ethics. Let's be really clear here. It's people that have ethics or otherwise. That's why it's a really difficult question to answer, because if you ask that question to two different people, you're going to get two different answers. If it's in my interests, let's take the tech platforms, for example, the Googles and so on and so forth. They want to do business in China because it's such a big market. We don't know what conversations take place behind the scenes that has them determine who to censor, for example, and who not to censor. it's guesswork. We're going into areas of moral hazard. Communism has no ethics either, by the way. So when I say capitalism has no ethics, neither does communism. I mean, they're just terms and meanings that are put onto the way that people manage things. So, are there ethical issues from the point of view of how a nation treats its citizens? Absolutely. I hear a lot of criticism about the United States, and from within. That's great. That's fantastic. That shows you that America is in fact alive. The ability to self-criticize, the ability to go onto the streets and have heated debate and arguments and little flashpoints here and there is a fantastic thing. That shows that that America's working. Mm. It's when it doesn't happen like that that you're going to be concerned. It's like you don't see that in China. Again, I come back to one of my initial comments, which was around, you can't tell me how to think. I am born free. Everyone is born free. We are born with the ability to think for ourselves. That's something that's given to us by, whether you believe in God or whether you believe in whatever, in creation or whatever. That's given to us. As we go through life, it's slowly taken away. America is the only country that I'm aware of in the world that has that freedom enshrined in documents. I got to say, the forefathers in America got to be some of the brightest people on the planet. They put in so many checks and balances into the American system that it's very, very difficult to tip it one way or the other. Very difficult. Having said that, I think they're going through a fairly critical phase at the moment. You don't have that in China. You don't have that even in Australia. We have a constitution, but it doesn't define what is meant by freedom.
I was going to ask you about that. It's a really good point that you bring up, because one of the other conversations that we have, we probably talk amongst sort of similar groups has been the concept of Australia or even Canada, where I'm originally from, or the UK, developing a Bill of Rights similar to America to enshrine freedom of speech. And the argument is, we already have freedom of speech, but how would you define the differences between the two, and are they roughly the same?
It's interesting because I love looking at America. I've worked in America, as you know. I'm starting to understand why Americans, there's a very strong Christian ethic in America. Because they say that those rights to freedom were given to them by God, in inverted commas. God, guns, and
liberty.
And when you think a bit more deeply into that and you peel back the onion, everyone on the planet is given that right when they're born, the right to be free. What America's, as I said, their forefathers did, saying, well, we have that right, and that right's been given to us by the mere fact that we've been born, i.e. God gave us that right because that's what they believed in doing it. How you then take Australia, how you then get a bunch of people together to write a Bill of Rights based on what principle? A lot of people look upon the patriots, as they call them in the US, as absolute nutters. They look upon them as right-wing conspiracy theorists because they say that we were created under God. I think people miss the point. I'm not a religious person, but I get the point that what they're saying is that we are born free and we have that right. The government does not give you the right to freedom. Now, if you get a bunch of people sitting down in a committee to write a Bill of Rights, it's going to be, we're giving you these rights. Not that these rights are inalienable and you have them from birth. It's not the government that gives you those rights. And that's a pretty darn major distinction. And I think it's why people get so passionate about it in the US, because it's not your right as a government official or as someone else to take my right that I was given in their terms by God. You didn't give it to me. Whereas if you do a Bill of Rights, it's almost like the Bill of Rights, as defined by the government, gives you your freedom. Look, it's you would need some very mature, very good thinkers to put it together. Whether it would survive the political process and get through to a referendum and all that sort of stuff is a completely and utterly different matter. At the right time, and you've got to remember that the US was born at a particular time when they had their they freed themselves from the Brits.
At a revolution, yeah. Time matters, doesn't it?
They had a catalyst to do this. Look, we're free from those people. We are free. We're being given that right, and then they peeled it back and said we're free from the time of birth. Different context, different lens, different conversation. Which is why when people say we should have a Bill of Rights, I sit there and say, well, I don't need someone else telling me what my freedoms are, because as far as I'm concerned, I am free. And you have laws and regulations and things like that that might regulate my behaviour. I'm not free to pick up a knife and go and stab someone. Well, I am actually. I can go and pick up a knife and go and stab someone, but I'm going to end up in jail. There are consequences, nor would I want to do it. But I'm allowed to think those thoughts and dismiss them too. Yeah. That's the difference.
Okay. Look, I want to start wrapping up today and get towards the end of this, but he's been peppered through our conversation constantly, and that's Trump. It's a name that doesn't go away. He's still going to be here. I know that you've had some dealings with him prior to being a president. I don't necessarily want to get into that. I just want to get, through the interpretation of all this information that you get, what does the American landscape sort of look like when we get to 2024? And what I mean by that, again, this last election, worse than I guess, or more convoluted than Trump defeating Hillary when they thought he was going to get smashed, is the fact that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Joe Biden had the highest vote count ever for a president in any election ever, but that still puts Trump as number 2 with the record turnout of this election. What does that actually mean for kind of where we're headed in 2024, in your opinion?
Oh, that's a big question. It is, Trump, as I said, did divide a nation. And the reason he divided a nation was because, there were a huge number of people who said, you know what, it's okay to think the way we think. And then there was the other side of the population that went, this guy's dangerous. Orange man and so on and so forth. And, there was, scandal upon scandal thrown at Trump, and all of them, were found to be wanting, in inverted commas. Impeached twice, and the only president in history to be impeached twice, but you've got to say that was pretty darn political. If he wanted to run again, I suspect he would be given the platform to run again. So it's really up to him. He's holding his cards very close to his chest. To understand politics in America, you've got to understand who Trump is. And you talked about dealings that I've had with Trump. I worked with an organization that built the Soho building, for example, the Trump Tower, which is now named something else. You grow up in the construction industry in New York, and it's a tough industry. People say that, the mafia gangs are gone. They haven't gone. They've just gone more underground, and they work in legitimate industries, and they organize things behind the scenes. To work in that sort of industry, you've got to be tough. To put up buildings at the rate that Trump put up buildings, you have to be tough. In America, something that people in other countries like Australia don't realise, they don't have things like workers' comp and things like that. Everything's based on litigation. You sue people. You have legal arguments. You take them to court. I mean, that's just par for the course in the US. Trump grew up in that. He got schooled in that. One of the things that amazed me over the whole Trump era is how much they threw at him and how hard he just kept coming back. I go back to the days of when I got a bit of an insight into him, out of the construction game in New York. So if he wants to stand again, he'll stand again. Will he divide the country if he stands again? Of course he will. He goes on very, I mean, the guy's got a sense of humor, and the issue is that the people on the left don't like his sense of humor and people on the right think it's fantastic. It's going to divide. I don't believe in personal attacks. He does the personal attack thing well. And it's one of the things that gives him an edge, because it makes people feel like they're part of the club, which is what they want. They want an identity. They want an identity that takes on authority. They want an identity that takes on the Washington swamp. And when people say the Washington swamp doesn't exist, I sit there and go, what planet are you on? I've had to deal with Washington myself, and I can tell you it's a swamp. Yes. I just shake my head. In Australia, you go through, we have these pecuniary interests where people have to write down what assets they hold and stuff like that. When I see the assets that some of the US politicians have,
it doesn't make any sense that
it doesn't make any sense.
They get a salary of 160 grand a year, and after 5 years, they've got a multi-million-dollar portfolio.
It just doesn't make sense, and you sort of shake your head and go, but that's America. America, look, I love Westerns because that's America. America is still the Wild West. The forefathers wrote the Constitution that way, to pit people against people. Why? Because it puts checks and balances in place. And what came out of that, the most powerful nation in the world. I hear all the commentators in America on the right side, the patriots, say, it's the greatest country in history. Well, that's debatable. But it is, a phenomenal country. And it grew out of, Europe's been around a lot longer than the US has. And the US went to world dominance pretty darn quickly in world history standards. The other thing that's interesting to when you talk geopolitics, China was the number one economy in the world for 1,800 of the last 2,000 years, which is a little known fact that people realise, and basically because of the number of people in the country. For them, and if you think of their mindset, knowing that, it's like, well, America's the young kid on the block. They've come along, and China knows how to play the long game. So to go back to the geopolitical conversation around China, you've also got to take that into context as well.
So Mark, that's all I've got for you today. If you've enjoyed and you've stuck with us through all of this, you can read more of Mark's thoughts as a contributing columnist in the Australian Business Executive. Mark, before we wrap up, why don't we just give you a platform to talk a little bit about your organization and who you help and what you actually do for them?
Yeah, look, basically, this organization has been going 11 years now. This is one of the businesses that I run. What we do is we just, we go in behind the scenes and we help people sort through matters. We help people get into a proactive stance in the way that they manage their reputation. We assist them through that process. I mean, I've had some clients on my books now for 8 years. So once they come on board, they tend to stick with us because, we deliver results for them.
Excellent. Well, I'm happy to do this again if you are at some point down the road.
Oh, look, I'd love to. And I really appreciate the opportunity. It's great having a chat and throwing all these things out there and seeing where they land. And hopefully there'll be a lot of criticism as well as praise on these sort of conversations, because we have to have them. So, I really appreciate your time. Cheers.
No problem. And yours as well. Thanks very much, Mark. We'll speak soon.
Yes, thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Romulus IT, offering fast, affordable remote support for common computer problems, including troubleshooting, health checks, virus removal, and software support. Visit romulusit.com to get your computer back on track.